Have you been thinking about trying gouache but are not sure where to start? Do you want to learn what gouache is, or do you want to improve your gouache skills? In today's video, I'll be going over 7 essential gouache tips for both beginners and experienced artists. If you're new to gouache, it's a type of water mixable paint that's similar to watercolor but has larger and more condensed pigment particles. This gives the paint a more opaque look than watercolor. It's characterized by its matte finish and its thick consistency. I would describe this paint as being somewhere in between acrylic and watercolor, but unlike acrylic, dry gouache can become fluid again when mixed with water. My first tip is about choosing the right surface. Gouache requires strong, thick paper, and you could use canvas, but it's not usually used unless you're applying the gouache in very thick layers. Even though it's thicker than watercolor, it's still usually applied in thin layers. Because gouache is a wet medium, a thick mixed media or watercolor paper will prevent the paper from buckling. In this video, I'm using Strathmore black mixed media paper, which works with both wet and dry media. Once you know which surface you're going to use, make sure you get a great brand of gouache. The brands I've tried are Arteza and Liquitex. Both are excellent, but I've heard Winsor & Newton and Holbein are some of the best brands. However, I'd say Arteza has the best value. You can get the 24 set of colors from Amazon for between $20 to $30. Between Arteza and Liquitex, I like the Arteza ones more because they have an overall thicker consistency than the Liquitex ones. But that's just my preference, and in this video, I'm mainly using the Arteza gouache. Once you start your painting, make sure to work from thin to thick layers. The more water you add to your paint, the thinner it will be. It's important to do this because when you add layers with very wet gouache, it can actually start to mix with the layers below because the water reactivates the dried paint. This can lead to muddy colors and cause you to add even more layers to fix it. This next tip relates to the previous one. If you want to blend, make sure the areas you want to blend are wet. So if you want to blend two colors, add them to the paper immediately after one another before they dry. If the area does dry, you can add water to it to make the layer fluid again, but it will be more difficult to make your blending even in that case. Another important tip for when you're starting out with gouache is that light colors dry darker and dark colors dry lighter. You can see it with this painting. When I apply the dark burgundy and black, you don't even really see them until they dry because of the black paper. On the other hand, the lighter colors like the hot pink and the light pink dry darker. Over time, you get used to this as you practice. When you practice painting with gouache, you might find that it's easier to create contrast in your painting because of its versatility. Because it's similar to watercolor when diluted, you can use the contrast of opaque versus translucent areas to create depth in your painting. This depth will give your painting a more realistic feel. I used this technique as I painted the right bottom side of the jaw. I used a very dark, diluted burgundy to create the shadow of the jaw and make it blend in with the black paper. Over top of that translucent layer, I added opaque details which made it look like the details were physically closer to the viewer. The reason you can get this realistic effect is because when you are contrasting diluted and opaque areas, you are essentially using hard and soft edges to create the illusion of distance. Having just the right amount of hard and soft edges is key to creating realistic art. Another tip for those who who are currently practicing painting with gouache is that colored pencil can look awesome when it's used on top of the paint. Because of the matte texture of gouache, it's easy to layer colored pencils to create very fine details and darken the dark areas. In this painting, I used white colored pencil to help make the highlights more crisp and create more hard edges. As you can see, most of these hard edges I created were in areas that appear to be closer to the viewer. Relating to the previous tip, this helped create more depth. However, you can also use colored pencil to create contrasting textures in the piece. When you use colored pencil over top of gouache, it creates a rough texture which contrasts well with the smooth and opaque textures of the paint. This ultimately creates visual interest in the painting, and this was my intention here as well. So those are my 7 gouache tips for both beginner and experienced artists. Please let me know in the comments which tip was the most helpful to you, and if you have any other great gouache tips to share, I would love to read those as well. As always, thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel.